Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been tracking the difficulties faced by the Defence Force in re-kitting itself to keep up with China's rise. That's its bread and butter. ASPI Executive Director Justin Bassi joins us in the studio. Welcome back, Justin. I suppose an initial observation, does all this fit together in the three-phase step that was outlined today?
Thanks, Greg. I think the phased approach looks very sensible. The government and the Defence Department had the challenge of not only explaining which boat would be the AUKUS submarine, but how would Australia manage the capability gap between now and when the first boat was operational. And I think the phased approach involving embedding of Australian personnel with US and UK navies, more visits from UK and US boats, the purchase of Virginia-class submarines, and then working with the trilateral partnership to deliver the AUKUS submarines was very sensible. It's historic, and it really is the three countries coming together and declaring an alignment on their national and international efforts because they all agree that the strategic circumstances demand it.
It's that third phase where the rubber really hits the road for Australia, building something that it's never done before. How confident are you that there's enough protection in phase two, if you like, to cover any blowouts, shortfalls, problems that are experienced?
Well, I think one thing you can guarantee is there will be problems, and I'm sure there will be delays and issues. But I do think the phased approach gives the best chance to learn and to mitigate those issues. One of those mitigations is the fact that the UK is building the same boat. And they'll be looking to deliver their first boat for the Royal Navy in the 2030s. It does mean that to some extent, not a full extent, but to some extent, Australia de-risks and we should learn from what the UK is doing. So by the time our first boat is in the water in the early 2040s, we've understood what some of those problems may be.
I know this hasn't been contemplated publicly, but do you think there's any possibility, if the SSN AUKUS project went smoothly, that America itself might end up adopting that model or something closely resembling that class?
I think so far the signs are that they won't do that. But one of the positive elements of the announcement is that flexibility for all three countries is clearly maximised. And it does mean that whether it be training on existing submarines, embedding officers in navies, working with the same combat weapons system, all of that means that the partnership is a truly trilateral one. And the flexibility is there, particularly if we look at the assessment, the apparent assessment that the Collins class, from a capability perspective, will diminish through the 2030s. It means that the flexibility of having multiple Virginia-class submarines as we work our way into the AUKUS submarines is very high.
Whether that number be 3 or 5. Now, Australia has to get its own house in order to uphold its end of the bargain, which brings us to money. What sort of trade-offs do you think within defence alone, let alone the broader business of government, but particularly within defence, are going to have to be made here?
Well, I do think that we will see in coming weeks the outcomes of the Defence Strategic Review, and that is a very important strategy that will show defence in its comprehensive nature. So we will see what decisions government has made outside of the nuclear submarines. And clearly the cost is eye-watering, and the government will have some tough decisions to make. But I do think that it is not a hypothetical to say that underinvestment in defence in the short term can have long-term costs for security and sovereignty. We are seeing a war right now, Greg, in Europe, where Russia has invaded Ukraine, in part due to Europe's underinvestment in defence, which resulted in a lack of deterrence. And Putin thought that he could have free rein to take over Ukraine. So underinvestment now doesn't necessarily mean there won't be costs in the future. We've seen the reverse.
And the mathematics of what Richard Marles laid out today suggests that you get somewhere around 2.3% of GDP delivering this nuclear program. You'd be in the camp, I imagine, that says that's still short of the mark in totality of the defence budget.
I do think that given the numbers that have been discussed today, I'd be surprised if the GDP figure didn't rise. But I also think that capability in this respect needs to drive the cost. So rather than setting a ceiling, it is positive that Australia has a bipartisan approach to now over 2% of GDP spent on defence. The rest of the world, particularly through Europe, is waking up to that need. But really, capability should drive the end figure.
Now, back in another life, when all this sort of started to emerge, I think you would have been in meetings with Tony Blinken and others in Washington when they spoke about, not leaving Australia alone on the pitch or on the field. What is your own degree of confidence about US cohesion around this project, notwithstanding changes of administration and Congress?
Sure. Well, both the blessing and burden of democracies is that governments go to elections and there can be changes, which does mean that current governments can't bind future governments. That is, on the whole, a very positive element. I do think, though, what we have seen across all three countries is a very bipartisan approach. That is really very important given the strategic circumstances we face. The working group, the Committee on AUKUS in the US, very bipartisan. So I think Australians can have confidence of where they are now. I think also Australians can have confidence that we have actually seen 4 years of a Trump presidency in which Australia did manage that presidency very well. And so where there were issues like steel and aluminium tariffs being bandied about across the world, Australia was able to manage that process, not simply because we were friends with the United States, but because we were viewed as a strategic partner. And so often the question here in defence or in AUKUS is what is in it for Australia. I think just as important is why did the United States go down the path of AUKUS? And it was because their circumstances demand it.
Yeah, interesting observation, that historical one. Justin, Bassi, great to get your perspective on all of this once again. Talk soon.